Tarps, I'm also curious what you think, and we talked about this last week, but obviously you weren't on the show. What do you think of Jalen Carter now and how he's going to do with the draft?
Yeah, I think he certainly had his stock impacted negatively, and that it going into it was all, is it going to be Jalen Carter or Will Anderson as the first non-quarterback off the board? Most people, I think, were leaning Jalen Carter, as I was, because I think it's harder to find a really good interior pass rusher than it is to find a really good edge rusher. But now, as this kind of hangs over his head, there will be teams that will take Jalen Carter off their draft board. This is a pretty serious thing, compounding mistakes that one fateful night, tragic incident, of course. Some teams will not be as worried. Other teams will dig into it more. If this is still hanging over his head, this could be on a lesser degree of what happened to L. Collins in the 2015 draft. That was a murder case, which is kind of a weird kind of full circle here to what we were talking about at the beginning. But that was hanging over his head on draft night, and L. Collins was supposed to be a first-round pick, and he ultimately went undrafted. He went undrafted. So if you're Jalen Carter, even if it's something where he, does have a punishment for this, you want it to come down before the draft happens in late April, because with L. Collins, it was like, well, what's going to happen? Is he implicated in this or not? And he, Will's saying, he was a lock, probably top half of the first round, and didn't even get picked.
The one thing about Lyle Collins too, though, is in that situation, if I recall correctly, it's insane how many different, that happened very close to the draft. Whereas with Jalen Carter, and you heard Daniel Jeremiah say it on the broadcast, teams were as surprised as we were by the Jalen Carter news that came out. They didn't know it was coming. And so that's where it gets really tricky, because it's not like the prospect has gone to the team. And again, sort of taken, just being from the objective NFL team standpoint here, this prospect has not come to these teams and said, here's an issue that I've got, that I've got hanging out there. This is something that's going to pop up. It's more like, one, did you know all this was coming? Two, were you trying to maybe hide it a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's what, and we don't know, but you're going to have a lot of questions you're going to have to ask, that you're going to be asked by these teams about not just what happened, why you were in this situation, but also the dissemination of the information to the teams. Why did it come out right before the combine, and why did teams not know about it, despite having already done some interviews, I believe?
Yeah, what was weird about it too is that, just real quick, that I believe that it was that he lied to the police and said he was a mile away from the incident when he was actually right there. That's what I'm saying about compounding mistakes. I think if it came out from the get-go that he was right there, he wasn't in the car, he wasn't responsible, would have been a red flag, but just a terrible incident, and kind of move on from there. But the fact that it's those character concerns, I think, are a little bit easier to understand now, where it's oh, but then he lied to the police, was not being fully truthful to NFL teams, and now it comes out right before he speaks at the combine. That's why I think it's still looming over his head, and teams are going to say, look, if you make a mistake, own up to it, instead of trying to, you as a marquee in the spotlight draft prospect, we're not going to be able to get away with, lying to the police and saying that you weren't there when you actually were.
Yeah, Thomas Scott has a hot take. Nolan Smith greater than Jalen Carter. I love this because he's one of my favorite storylines coming out of the combine. But what do y'all think?
Will, go ahead, take it.
I think that maybe the take is I think that's a hot take. It's not crazy. Maybe the hot take. It's a hot take, but I don't think it's entirely insane that he gets drafted over Jalen Carter either. I think just because of what there is a lot of unknown with what is going on, and that when there's a lot of unknown, it creates variables in an already variable draft situation.
And one thing I'll say about that, it's not a scorching hot take, because Nolan Smith was the #1 overall recruit coming out of high school just a few years ago. So the talent is undeniably there. He's been on the radar since really his freshman season at Georgia, and before the torn pec. Very, very productive as a pass rusher, again, without having a loaded pass rush move arsenal. He was just winning with burst and bend around the corner. That's exactly what I remembered and really didn't like about Rashawn Gary. But again, Rashawn Gary's become a good player. Hassan Reddick, similar size. So it wouldn't be crazy if, there are some maturity issues with Jalen Carter, maybe gets off to a slower start in the NFL. And in a few years, Nolan Smith kind of rounds his game together and becomes that elite pass rusher because he does have those uncoachable traits.
Yeah, Billy just put in the chat, would you draft Jalen Carter in the first round? Traps, would you?
I would. I would feel a little more leery if it was in the top 10 at this point, and I could give a completely different answer if we do get some more clarity in like a month. But that's what during the combine, when I got asked that question on a few radio spots, that's what I said. Like, it's easy for me or Will or Katie to say, yeah, still pick him there. It's a different thing when you're the GM. Say you're a first-time GM and you're seeing all these really good prospects out there. It's a great defensive line class. Are you going to roll the dice on someone with that hanging over his head, or are you going to pick Lucas Van Ness from Iowa or Kalijah Cansey from Pittsburgh that pretty close, maybe 80 or 90% of Jalen Carter, but don't have the off the field stuff to really be worried about? I think when you're really in the line of fire there, it's like easier to pick the prospect that doesn't have those off field concerns.
I mean, I'll be we don't know the exact details of what happened. So I stick my foot in my mouth all the time with stuff like this. But as it stands right now, I'm probably pulling the trigger on Jalen Carter if he falls to me. And I think that I mean, I think it falls out of the top 5. I'm probably pulling the trigger. If he falls out of the top 10, I'm definitely pulling the trigger. Now, again, these circumstances, NFL teams will know more. There will be teams that have Jalen Carter off their board, because they just don't, they're not going to go that direction, and there will be, there'll be teams who move them down a lot. There'll be teams who don't move them down, et cetera, et cetera. I think that what you like, my thing is, again, I go back to that quote from Steve Keim, former Cardinals GM. If Hannibal Lecter ran a 4.40, he'd get drafted. That's just the bottom line.
But maybe taking advice from Steve Keim as a GM is, but you're right. I get what you're saying.
It's true. It's like if Jalen Carter was a 5th round pick, it's just, we're not even having this discussion, right? Like it's only because he's a first round caliber talent that it is, I think everybody right now, given the uncertainty of what we don't like, what we know and what we don't know, is like, if he fell to my team, I'm probably taking that value. Could that change with information? Yeah, it could change both ways, right? So I think as of right now, I'm sort of in that same camp where like I'm taking the value because, unless he did something really, really, really heinous, in like, or he's going to be charged, what I'm saying? Like this, like you win by getting value, like, I mean, I don't, it stinks, but that's the truth of the matter,
Yeah. Al Bundy in the chat said he should be drafted by anyone if Anderson is gone, which is pretty much where y'all are at too.
Yeah. Not that far off. Yeah.